Welcome to the Stratcom podcasts. I'm your host, Kübra Akkoç, a journalist at TRT World. Today we are going to talk about cybersecurity in space. And joining me now is Shaun Waterman, who is a journalist and content strategist covering cybersecurity, space and defense technology. Shaun, great to have you here.
Thanks very much for having me on.
I want to start with your recent piece I read recently, actually. And it caught my attention because its headline was How to Hack a Satellite. And I thought, can we really do that stuff? So my first question to you is, can you really hack a satellite?
What you've got to remember is that space systems are extremely complex, systems of systems. So with the satellite, you have the satellite that's in space. It's connected to a ground station on Earth by radio communications. And there are computer systems, both in the ground station and on the satellite, which, like other computer systems on Earth, can be hacked. Yes, they can be made to do things that they're not supposed to, which is the sort of definition of hacking. So yes, it's theoretically possible. And in fact, the Space Force, the US Space Force, recently staged a contest where they got teams of hackers from all over the world to sign up to try and hack it wasn't a real satellite, it was a satellite equipment, on the ground. It's called the flat sat.
All right.
But, so not only is it possible, it's actually being done.
Why did they do that? Why did the US Space Force invite all the hackers to just try their skills and show them whether they can really hack a satellite?
That's how you improve. One of the ways you improve security. These exercises, they're called Capture the Flag or CTF. They're sort of, practice battles really between groups of hackers who are trying to, in this case, all of the 8 teams had their own satellite that they were trying to defend, and then they were trying to hack everyone else's satellite. So what you learn through that is, where are the satellites vulnerable? What are the flaws in the software that runs them that hackers can exploit to make, to take over the equipment? And that is, so that's why they did it. Yeah. Because that's how a lot of new vulnerabilities called 0 days are discovered, through this kind of practice hacking.
I see. So it means maybe the space, cybersecurity in space, getting more and more attention now. And do you think that's the case? And if you think so, why is the issue of this cybersecurity in space getting more attention today?
Well, I think it is getting more attention, and it's getting more attention because of what's happening in space. These low Earth orbit or LEO constellations that people like Starlink and OneWeb and Amazon are launching, they're going to have thousands and thousands of satellites in them. There's a couple of thousand of satellites orbiting the Earth right now. In 5 or 10 years, there could be 20,000. So space is getting a lot more crowded. And these satellites, the new generation of these low Earth orbit satellites, are actually designed to be updated, just like your smartphone. Traditionally, you put a satellite in space and there it is in space. There's not really very much you can do to update it. And if it breaks down, well, you're stuck. But now this new generation of satellites being launched by Starlink and these other startups are they're designed to run on software, just like your phone, and just like your phone, they're designed to be periodically upgraded to improve their capabilities. Now that means, every connection with the ground, every way of getting into the satellite to change the settings, to change the way the software operates, every one of those is a possible backdoor for a hacker. So this new generation could, they're working very hard to make them secure, but could turn out to be more vulnerable. So that's getting attention. And then the other thing is, increasingly there's sort of tension and concerns about conflict in space as well. We saw the recent Russian anti-satellite weapons test where they basically blew up. They used it's called a direct descent vehicle or direct descent kill vehicle. It's basically like a missile that you launch. It struck a Russian, a defunct Russian spy satellite, destroyed it. So, and we know that on Earth, these cyber attacks, hacking and so forth, forms an important dimension of the conflict between, superpowers, between Russia and America, for example. And everyone seems to think that the same will be true in space, that if there's conflict in space, cyber attacks will be part of that.
Right. Yeah. Interesting times ahead in terms of that. And you mentioned vulnerability. About vulnerability, these new constellations launched by Starlink, OneWeb, and Amazon, they launched the new low Earth orbit satellite constellations. So will they be vulnerable to hacking? And if so, what are the countermeasures, or are there any countermeasures to avoid these kind of attacks?
So one thing that's true about these satellites is there'll be an awful lot of them. So at the moment, if you look at a traditional satellite communications company like Inmarsat, the British, they have their satellites are in what's called geostationary orbit. That means they're 20,000 miles plus above the surface of the Earth, but they're in an orbit where they're fixed in relation to the Earth. So, if that satellite's over London, it stays over London. As the Earth turns, it turns. And so it's always over London. Now, that means that you can have global coverage with just a handful of these satellites. Inmarsat, I believe, have 4 or 5 or 6 maybe in their constellation. And that means that if you're able to knock one of those satellites out, you've put a great big hole in Inmarsat's global coverage, because a fifth of their whole global coverage is gone once that satellite's out. With a constellation like Starlink, which will have 10 to 12,000 satellites, you knock one of those out and you've basically achieved nothing. You haven't put a substantial hole in their coverage at all. The satellites are a minute or two apart for, as they circle the globe. So another one will be along in a couple of minutes. And so these low Earth orbit constellations are much more resilient in that sense. And that's always a good defense to have because, if you're a nation state, you've got great resources, but they're not unlimited and you're going to use them where they're be most effective. And that probably isn't against, 1 or 2 low Earth orbit satellites out of a constellation of 12,000. On the other hand, the thing about cyber attacks is they scale very easily. You can launch, because they can be automated, you can launch hundreds of thousands of them at a time. Just like you can send millions of spam emails. So it's possible to foresee a situation in which some kind of automated cyber attack is directed at the whole constellation like that, all 12,000 satellites. That could be devastating. It's hard to tell is the short answer, whether they'll be more or less vulnerable. But they'll definitely be more resilient in the sense that, knocking 1 or 2 or even a handful of satellites out, out of orbit, out of the sky, that's not really going to affect the coverage of these low Earth orbit constellations.
Right. Now I'd like to ask you about another piece of yours. It's also recent from November, I guess. It's called Space Hacking Risks for Cyber Policy Test for Biden Administration. In the piece, it seems like you are not very happy that the administration's decision not to designate space system as a new critical national industrial sector, right? Why is that?
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm happy or unhappy. A lot of people are unhappy about it, and I quote them in the story, but I don't have a dog in the fight necessarily. So this is, it's not just about definitions, right? There's a question, government has a special category called critical infrastructure. That's private sector businesses whose operations are considered absolutely essential to the national economy. So things like banks, transit systems, right? The air transportation or the rail network, all of this stuff, got critical infrastructure. Now, there are 16 different sectors that range from, finance, that electricity is in there, oil and gas is another one. Space is not one of those sectors. And yet, space is very critical. Without GPS, it's not just Uber and Grubhub and all of those very convenient apps wouldn't work. The banking, the ATM system, where you get money out from your bank wouldn't work either because that relies on GPS. And increasingly, more and more industries, agriculture, for example, on a big farm, they will move, there'll be automated machinery, waters, irrigates the fields or harvests or plants crops, all of that done, again, through GPS. And there's other kinds of data and communications data that are also, increasingly integrated into more and more of these vital businesses. So a lot of people in the space industry want to see the sector designated as critical infrastructure. And it's not just a matter of what you call something. There's a lot of procedures. There are special procedures set up to provide sanitized versions of secret intelligence that the United States has collected.
So, you said space is critical. And coming back to satellites, how critical are satellites to the functioning of the global economy? You mentioned apps, you mentioned GPS.
Well, they're very critical. And but it's, as we talked about with the low Earth orbit constellations, they're also increasingly resilient. It's not just GPS. GPS is the constellation of GPS satellites is run by the US military, but there's also now a European version called Galileo. There's a Chinese, fleet of satellites now that provide, GPS type services to across the globe, to their subscribers. The Japanese have one. So there's now almost half a dozen. The Russians have another. So there's half a dozen different constellations providing the same GPS type service of being able to know exactly where you are. And because you know exactly where you are, you also know exactly what time it is. So those are very crucial, very critical, but they're also, duplicated. What there isn't, what we don't have the duplication for yet is a lot of the Earth observation, especially this new technology called SARS, basically take pictures of the surface, even in the dark or through cloud cover and rain and so forth. Remarkable stuff, increasingly used, for example, in the insurance industry, used in disaster relief and recovery. And there, there's literally a handful of these satellites in orbit right now, more a plan for the future. So, yes, increasingly critical.
Critical. Right. So my last question to you is, so you already somehow mentioned like Russia versus United States one. So could there be really a war in space, a real war, all-out war, of course, in space terms? So what role would hacking play in such a conflict if there would be a one?
Well, I mean, I think, there could be conflict. There's already a lot of tension between America and China, for example. The American military, when it used to do war games, where it would game out a conflict with China, the American commander playing the Chinese commander, the first thing they would always do, knock out all of America's space assets, because that's what gives America the edge on the battlefield. The high-tech precision weapons, the instantaneous communications, all of that relies totally on space-based assets. So I think if there was a major conflict, you might well see that spread to space. Now, in terms of the role that cyber might play in that, I think we have to hope, Kubra, that it's a major role. And the reason we have to hope it's a major role is because if it's not cyber, they're going to be knocking these things out of the sky. And just like the Russian test we talked about earlier, the anti-satellite weapon, what that did when it destroyed their defunct satellite was create a huge cloud of debris, right? Thousands and thousands of particles, some of them as big as a fist, but some of them perhaps no bigger than a speck of dust, but traveling at tens of thousands of miles an hour. So, and at that speed, even a fingernail-sized fragment, if it, hits the wrong piece of equipment, goes through the wrong bit of the spacecraft, can have a pretty damaging effect. Now, if you can imagine that cloud of debris multiplied 20, 30, 40-fold, as weapons are deployed to destroy satellites in orbit, you can see that it quickly, generate more and more debris. And then what happens is the risk you run is this terrible thing called the Kessler effect, or a cascade effect, where those clouds of debris in turn, damage or destroy other satellites in orbit, which then that in turn creates more debris, more collisions with satellites, and eventually the orbit becomes unsustainable. You can't actually put anything up there because there's too much of this debris flying around, and it'll effectively destroy anything that you launch into orbit. So that would be a terrible, terrible consequence. Whereas with a cyber attack, the effects are temporary. They're often reversible. The satellite stays in orbit, even if you fry its brain, the body continues to orbit, and it doesn't create these huge debris clouds. So for that reason, a lot of military theorists think that cyber attack is actually probably quite likely going to be the preferred form of combat in space. Because if now the Chinese, the Russians, they all have their own space assets. They all have their own GPS systems and their own Earth observation data that their industries rely on. So, you start knocking things out of orbit and you create one of these cascade effects, and pretty soon everyone's in the same boat, which is sinking fast, right? So a lot of military theorists think cyber attacks, which could be temporary, perhaps even reversible, and don't damage the physical infrastructure of the satellite, probably the preferred means of combat in space.
I see, right. Shaun Waterman, pleasure to have you on our podcast series. Thanks for this fascinating discussion.
Well, I really appreciated your questions, Kubra, and best of luck with the Stratcom project. It sounds very interesting.
Thank you very much.